Act. I want to thank Chairman Klein and Higher Education Subcommittee Chairwoman Fox for their work on and support of this measure. I also want to commend the Ranking Member, Mr. Miller, Subcommittee Ranking Member Hinuosa, and our Democratic Committee colleagues for their contributions to this bill. Few decisions in life are bigger than whether to attend college and which college to attend. Yet many families struggle to wade through the complicated maze of statistics available to find the information they need to make fully informed, cost-conscious decisions. Consequently, they may choose schools or programs that don't meet their needs and leave them with high debt and limited career potential. Despite federal efforts to improve data collection and transparency in the higher education system, families and students still struggle, and institutions of higher learning are spending more time and money than ever. During the 2012-2013 academic year, institutions spent an estimated 850,000 man-hours and almost $31 million to fill out required federal surveys. Higher education leaders have highlighted several of these requirements as duplicative to state and local transparency efforts and may partially contribute to the increase in college costs. Through the Improving Post-Secondary Education Data for Students Act, we hope to simplify this process and help ensure students can access the information they need to make good decisions while lessening the burden on colleges and universities that have far too many reporting requirements today. The bill would require the Department of Education to evaluate the information colleges and universities are required to provide to determine what helps make students better consumers and what simply buries them in paper, and the schools they attend in paper as well. The information yielded by this report will play a critical role in assisting the Education and Workforce Committee's efforts to reauthorize the Higher Education Act. We need to ensure students have the information they actually need in a user-friendly manner to help them make the best decisions they can. We also must streamline the current regulatory burden of unnecessary and unhelpful reporting requirements imposed on institutions of higher education. This bill will help guide that process. I urge all of our colleagues to support the Improving Post-Secondary Education Data for Students Act and reserve the balance of my time.
There's a balance of his time. The gentleman from New Jersey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to rise in support of the gentleman's legislation. I think it's an example of how we can work together and achieve a benefit for the American people. I commend him for introducing the bill and would outline our reasons for our support. Probably the second largest expenditure most Americans make in their lifetime is a college education for themselves or for their children, second only to their real estate, to the home that they buy. It's surprising how little consumer information is available to families before they make that choice. If you buy a phone, you can find out what apps it can run and how much bandwidth it has, how much it can store, what it can do, what it can't do. You can find all this information about what the phone costs, what it does, and how it works. But if you're about to enroll in a school that purports to teach website design, or if you're about to send your son or daughter off to a college to major in philosophy or engineering, it's surprising how little you know about that school. And the gentleman's proposal is that there be an effort by the Department of Education to make those data more accessible and more transparent for students and their families. Questions that are natural to ask. What does it cost to go to the school? What happens to students when they graduate from the school? What kind of jobs do they get? How much money do they make? How much debt do they graduate with? Who transfers in and out of the school and what numbers? How many people finish their education at the schools? I'm not suggesting that there's any one-size-fits-all list of questions, that it's the right list of questions. What I'm suggesting is that the maximum amount of information should be available to families and students to make reasoned decisions about this sort of thing. The only comment that I'd make further is that we would encourage, Mr. Speaker, the committee leadership to consider bipartisan legislation that's been sponsored by Mr. Duncan Hunter, Jr. on the majority side. I'm involved in it on the minority side, And in the other body, it's sponsored by Senators Wyden and Warner along with Senator Rubio, that would create this kind of information in a user-friendly, web-based environment as soon as possibly could be done. I view this bill as complementary to that effort and look forward to working with the gentleman and the other leaders of the committee on this issue. Would finally say that on our side, we do strongly believe that the time has come for a full reauthorization of the Higher Education Act. There are myriad issues. Tomorrow we'll have student loan financing issues on the floor. There's questions about Pell Grants, the cost of college, and numerous other issues that we think are best dealt with in an omnibus and comprehensive fashion. Having said that, we commend the gentleman for his introduction of the bill, urge its support, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves the balance of his time. The gentleman from Indiana.
Thank the gentleman from New Jersey for his comments and his leadership on this important topic. Certainly pledged to work with you on both this bill and the other bills that you mentioned. Would now like to yield 1 minute to my good friend, the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Cantor.
The gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the gentleman. I want to thank him for his leadership in bringing this bill forward, as well as appreciate the ranking member's support on this as well. Mr. Speaker, I rise today to support the Improving Post-Secondary Education Data for Students Act. American moms and dads are working tirelessly to help their children achieve their dreams. For many, that dream includes college. However, the cost of post-secondary education has become increasingly difficult for a lot of families to bear. Young graduates today are not only confronting a tough job market when they leave school, they are continually facing a growing mountain of debt that is financially burdensome and extremely difficult to pay back. Many students choose a school and their major without ever knowing the earning potential of their fields of study. This leaves many young Americans with a lower than expected income and struggling to pay down their loans once they graduate. For some, it can take decades. This has got to change. In my home state of Virginia, we've become a leader in attempting to address this problem. In 2012, Virginia enacted a requirement that schools in our state publish information regarding the proportion of graduates with employment, their average salary, and higher education debt at 18 months and 5 years after graduation. I expect that this data will become extremely useful to parents and students alike. Unfortunately, the data available to Virginia is limited to graduates who remain in the Commonwealth. This means that information available in the state database fails to fully capture students that graduate from a school like the University of Richmond, which attracts students from 46 different states. Very often, they go on to take jobs throughout the country where they become leaders in their field. We can help resolve this situation. The federal government currently has a significant amount of data that could help parents and students make better decisions regarding the financial benefits of prospective schools and majors. But this information is often hard to understand or difficult to access. This bill requires the Secretary of Education to convene a 15-member advisory panel to provide the recommendations on how to improve the information available to parents and students when deciding on their schools and majors. This panel will provide an interim report within 6 months and a final one within 1 year for Congress's consideration during the reauthorization of the Higher Ed Act. This legislation will serve to kickstart the process of improving transparency in higher education and provide students and parents with information that they need to make informed decisions so that a college education can continue to be a source of empowerment for millions of Americans. This bill is a great step in the right direction. I want to thank the gentleman from Indiana and his leadership, Mr. Messer, Chairman John Klein, Chairwoman Virginia Fox, and the rest of the Education and Workforce Committee for their work on this issue, and I urge my colleagues to support this bill, and I yield back.
Gentleman from New Jersey, seek recognition.
I would just ask my friend, Mr. Speaker, if he has any other speakers.
2 others.
I would reserve the balance.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Indiana.
Would like to recognize my friend and colleague from the great state of Indiana, Mrs. Brooks.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today in strong support of the Improving Post-Secondary Education Data for Students Act. I am the mother of a current college student and a recent college graduate, as well as a former general counsel and senior vice president at Ivy Tech Community College in Indiana. I personally and professionally understand the difficult and often life-defining decisions our young people make when they decide where to attend college. Students want to make the most educated decision they can, but currently they struggle to access and process all the data they need to make that best decision for themselves and their future. And it's not because there's a lack of data being reported. Currently, the federal government requires colleges and universities to report overwhelming amounts of information. As Congressman Messer already said, rather than having institutions across the country spend over 850,000 hours and almost $31 million to fill out all these required federal surveys, why not allow our higher ed institutions to spend those hours and those dollars doing a better job serving our students in classrooms, advising students, and figuring out ways to lower tuition costs? The problem is that the federal government is not requiring the right information and putting it in a readable and understandable format for students. And so this bill directs the Department of Education to conduct a survey on which factors students and families want and need when researching their post-secondary options. It's common sense. I appreciate that it's a bipartisan piece of legislation that will benefit students in our higher ed institutions. This bill is simple. It helps Congress improve transparency as we approach reauthorization of the Higher Education Act. I applaud the work of my fellow Hoosier and colleague, Mr. Messer, and I urge adoption of this important bill. I yield back.
Does the gentleman from New Jersey continue to reserve?
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I do.
Thank you. Gentleman from Indiana.
Thank you, gentlemen. Would now like to recognize my good friend from Georgia and yield 2 minutes to Mr. Collins.
Gentleman's recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in strong support of this legislation, and I have a personal take on this. I have a 17-year-old son, Copeland, and my wife and I are in the process of guiding him through the difficult and often complex process of choosing a higher education institution to attend. As families across America know, there are a lot of factors to consider when assessing what institution will provide my son with the best opportunity to graduate college and be set on a path to professionally succeed. In this economy, our children deserve the best possible chance we can give them to find a job that will allow them to provide for themselves and their future families. The key to good decision-making is having accurate information, and this legislation will provide my son Copeland and all the other students of Northeast Georgia with the best possible data that they and their parents can use to select the right post-secondary education path for them. I urge my colleagues to join me in supporting this bill, and I'd like to thank the gentleman from Indiana for his leadership and the nature in which we bring this forward. It's a positive solution for our country, and it's a positive solution as we look forward to the families looking at this decision for higher education. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from New Jersey.
We continue to reserve, Mr. Speaker.
The gentleman continues to reserve. The gentleman from Indiana.
We have no additional speakers. No additional speakers, sir.
Gentleman from Indiana. Excuse me, New Jersey.
Yeah, it's not so bad. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Again, this is an example of how we can work together and accomplish something constructive for the American people. We're pleased to support this bill. Would urge a yes vote. We yield back the balance of our time.
Gentleman yields back the balance of his time. The gentleman from Indiana.
You know, I'm a former state legislator from Indiana. They used to say on the House floor back there, good bill should pass. And it's great when you have the opportunity to work together across the aisle on a bill that just makes sense. My colleague from North Carolina, Ms. Fox, made the comment that there is a lot of data out there for families, but there's a difference between data and information. And our goal of this bill is to help bring this data together, get past the data dump, and try to get families the information they need, while at the same time lessening the regulatory burden on our colleges and universities. They're doing the best they can with limited resources as well. So with that, I urge my colleagues to support the bill and to yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back the balance of his time. All time has expired. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass the bill H.R. 1949 as amended? Those in favor will say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, 2/3 being in the affirmative, the rules are suspended. The bill is passed, and without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas rise?
Mr. Speaker, I move to suspend the rules and pass H.R. 271, Resolving Environmental and Grid Reliability Conflicts Act of 2013.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
Union Calendar Number 61, H.R. 271, a bill to clarify that compliance with an emergency order under Section 202C of the Federal Power Act may not be considered a violation of any federal, state, or local environmental law or regulation and for other purposes.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Olson, and the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green, will each control 20 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Olson.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and insert extraneous materials in the record on H.R. 271.
Without objection, so ordered.
And, Mr. Speaker, I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today in support of H.R. 271, the Resolving Environmental and Grid Reliability Conflicts Act of 2013. My colleagues and I carefully drafted this bill last year to resolve a conflict between the Federal Power Act and environmental rules that, if left unresolved, could create serious problems for the reliability of our nation's electric grid. With the hot summer coming and power demand set to surge, the potential for dangerous power outages is rising alongside the mercury. Just last week, states like California and my home state of Texas were warned by regulators that electricity reserve margins could dip dangerously low. Texas faces critical electricity shortages in the next few years. We simply won't have enough power, reliable power, to guarantee our grid. Rolling blackouts in Texas alone would impact over 25 million people. As coal plants continue to be shut down, pockets of areas across the country could quickly experience blackouts. When the power fails and the AC sets down on a hot 100-degree day, it's the elderly, the young, and the poor who suffer first. Prior experience shows that in rare and limited circumstances, emergency actions have been needed to ensure the reliable delivery of electricity. When an emergency exists due to a sudden increase in demand for electricity or a shortage of supply, the Department of Energy has a tool of last resort to address the emergency. That tool is an emergency order under Section 202C of the Federal Power Act. DOE can order a grid connection to be made or a power plant to generate electricity when outages occur due to weather events, equipment failures, or electricity supply is too low to avoid a blackout. As they should, DOE can mandate a company to comply with a 202C law order, even if it means a brief violation of environmental laws. Unfortunately, under current law, a company or individual can be penalized for violating environmental laws even when they're following a federal order to avoid a blackout. In recent years, these conflicting federal laws have resulted in lawsuits and heavy fines for electricity providers complying with legal orders. Unless Congress passes this legislation to resolve the potential conflict in the laws, the Section 202C tool is in jeopardy. H.R. 271 eliminates the uncertainty facing power generators and their customers by providing a needed safety valve, which clarifies that compliance with an emergency order under Section 202C of the Federal Power Act may not be considered a violation of any federal, state, or local environmental law or regulation. To be clear, These emergency orders are not issued lightly and only under extreme power reliability scenarios. In the last 30 years, this authority has only been invoked about half a dozen times. If the need arises, my legislation will ensure that DOE works to minimize any adverse environmental impacts by balancing environmental interests with liability considerations. While some people are concerned that H.R. 271 doesn't go far enough to protect plant operators who may face lawsuits from environmental groups, my bill is a vast improvement over current law. Major utilities, both public and investor-owned power trade associations, believe that a federal court would be hard-pressed to overrule an emergency order issued by the DOE. In a crisis, if this bill becomes law, DOE will give deference, which will apply to utilities following these orders. DOE will consult with clean air regulators, but the final decision in emergencies will always firmly remain in the hands of those charged with keeping the power flowing. The protection H.R. 271 offers is critical, and given the number of plant retirements that have been announced as operators grapple with new EPA air and water rules, I worry that DOE may need to use its emergency authority more often in the future. I still expect DOE emergency orders to be the exception and not the rule. In those rare instances when the authority is invoked, we should not punish generators who are simply following orders from the federal government to keep the power on in an emergency. Resolving this conflict is critical, which is why I reintroduced this bipartisan legislation in the 113th Congress. It will allow America's power companies to comply with federal orders to maintain grid reliability during a power emergency without the threats of lawsuits or penalties. I'm pleased with the widespread bipartisan support this bill has received. This bill is proof that we can find common ground in Washington, D.C. when working to address a glitch in federal law and provide a reliable energy supply to all Americans. I want to thank Chairman Fred Upton, Ranking Member Henry Waxman, and Subcommittee Chairman Ed Whitfield, and Subcommittee Ranking Member Bobby Rush for their support and assistance in moving this bill forward. I also want to thank my original co-sponsors on the committee, Gene Green of Texas, Mike Doyle of Pennsylvania, Lee Terry of Nebraska, and Adam Kinzinger of Illinois, and their staffs for working with me to fix this problem, to keep the power running for all Americans in an emergency. Mr. Speaker, I urge my colleagues to support this common sense bipartisan legislation that protects energy consumers, the environment, and those who provide the power. Thank you. I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves his time. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today in strong support of H.R. 271, the Resolving Environmental and Grid Reliability Conflicts Act. I'm proud to be an original co-sponsor of this bill that we worked on with my good friends Congressman Pete Olson and Congressman Mike Doyle last Congress. This bipartisan legislation addresses a conflict in federal law whereas a company or individual can be held liable for violating environmental laws when the federal government orders them to generate power to avoid blackouts. Section 202C of the Federal Power Act gives the Department of Energy the authority to order an electric generating facility to generate power in order to avoid electric reliability emergency. At the same time, the possibility of violating environmental laws and regulation may restrict the operation of power plants or transmission lines. For example, a company may have a mothballed power plant because it reached its clean air emissions limit for the year. So if a company or publicly owned utility is ordered by the DOE to operate under Section 202 202C. At the same time, it's prohibiting from operating in accordance with the DOE order due to environmental limitations. Their operator must choose which legal mandate to follow. These conflicting legal mandates should not complicate an electric liability crisis, but they do. It's not fair for the government to put a power generator in this position. As a longtime member of the Energy and Commerce Committee and someone who's worked on both reliability and environmental legislation during that time, I can honestly say that it was never our intention to put electric generating facilities in a position of having to choose between compliance with one law over the other. And while there's only been a couple of instances to date where a generator has been in this situation, this potential for conflict will only grow as several coal-fired plants are scheduled to be taken offline in the coming years. That is why Congress needs to address this issue. Otherwise, we're risk threatening our electric reliability, and for certain regions of the country, this issue is coming fast. H.R. 271 simply clarifies that if an emergency order issued pursuant to Section 202C of the Federal Power Act may conflict with an environmental law or regulation, the order shall expire no later than 90 days after issuance. This deadline does two things. First, this ensures that the Department of Energy continues to have the necessary authority to keep the lights on in true emergencies. However, if it then gives DOE the authority to renew and reissue the order for an additional 90-day period only after consulting with appropriate federal agencies and including conditions submitted by these agencies to mitigate any potential adverse environmental impacts. Mr. Speaker, this is not a messaging bill. It's not an anti-EPA bill or even anti- or toxic standards bill. Instead, it's a common-sense bill that will address a very worrisome deficiency in current law that is only going to become more prominent in the coming years. I want to also thank our colleague, our ranking member, Mr. Waxman, for his continued support of this bill. This is one of a handful of bills that actually were supported by both Democrats and Republicans in the Energy and Commerce Committee as support across the utility industry. My hope is our Energy and Commerce Committee will continue to refer to the floor truly bipartisan bills like this one. It's time we get back to legislating and not messaging. With that, I encourage my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to support this bill. And, Mr. Speaker, I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves his time.
Mr. Speaker, I have no one on my side I'm willing to speak, so I'm willing to close, if my colleague is as well.
Mr. Speaker, I'll yield back my time and just encourage our colleagues to support this great legislation.
The gentleman yields back his time. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In closing, I want to thank Chairman Upton, Ranking Member Waxman, Subcommittee Chairman Whitfield, and Subcommittee Ranking Member Rush for their assistance in getting this bill passed in the 113th Congress. If my colleagues want to go home next week with an example of bipartisanship for their constituents, vote for H.R. 271. I yield back the balance of my time.
Its time has expired. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass the bill H.R. 271? Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the Chair, two-thirds being in the affirmative, the rules are suspended and the bill is passed. And without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. The Chair announces the Speaker's appointment pursuant to Section 2 of the Migratory Bird Conservation Act, 16 U.S.C. 715A, and the order of the House of January 3, 2013 of the following members on the part of the House to the Migratory Bird Conservation Commission.
Mr. Whitman of Virginia and Mr. Dingell of Michigan.
The Chair announces the Speaker's appointment pursuant to Section 672B of the National Defense Authorization Act of Fiscal Year 2013, Publication L 112 through 239, and the order of the House of January 3, 2013 of the following individuals on the part of the House to the Military Compensation and Retirement Modernization Commission.
Mr. Dov S. Sakim of Silver Spring, Maryland, and Mr. Michael R. Higgins of Washington, D.C.
The Chair lays before the House a communication.
The Honorable, the Speaker, House of Representatives, Sir, pursuant to Section 4C of House Resolution 5, 113th Congress, I am pleased to reappoint the Honorable James P. McGovern of Massachusetts as co-chair of the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission. Thank you for your attention to these appointments. Signed sincerely, Nancy Pelosi, Democratic Leader.
The Chair will now entertain requests for 1-minute speeches. For what purpose does the gentleman from Indiana seek recognition?
Ask unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute and to revise and extend remarks.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
I thank the Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise today to recognize an exceptional Hoosier couple, Mr. Benton and Mrs. Sandy Marks, who are being honored with the 2013 HAI Life Distinguished Service Award by the Hazen Hebrew Academy of Indianapolis. Mr. Marks has served as president of both the Hazen Hebrew Academy and the Bureau of Jewish Education, as Jewish Federation campaign chair and president, and as chairman of the State of Israel Bonds. He has also served as a member of the Indiana Judicial Nominating Commission and has volunteered with numerous other civic and professional organizations. Mrs. Marks has devoted her life to education, serving on the Hazen Hebrew Academy Education Committee and as a board member of the school. She recently retired from Washington Township Schools, but continues to serve the district and Indiana as a school psychologist. She is also a trusted friend and confidant of mine on education issues in my capacity as chairman of the subcommittee on K-12 education. Mr. and Mrs. Marks are wonderful entrepreneurs, excellent philanthropists, and most of all, friends. I am honored to know them, even since my days as Indiana Secretary of State, and I know they will continue to serve as leaders in our Indiana community for many years to come. Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Illinois seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's an honor to follow the subcommittee chairman from Indiana and K-12, and because I'm going to recognize a leader in our K-12 community in Illinois. Mr. Speaker, I rise today to recognize Matthew Maddox for being named the VFW National Citizenship Education Elementary Teacher of the Year. Matthew is a 5th grade teacher at Columbus Elementary School in Edwardsville, Illinois, and he was selected as the Teacher of the Year from among 60,000 other teachers for his dedication to education, innovative teaching style, and resource development. In the classroom, Matthew has made it a commitment to recognize the sacrifices made by our nation's veterans by regularly inviting veterans to visit and share their stories to help make history much more relevant to his students. In addition to being an educator, Matthew has proudly served our country in the Illinois National Guard's 445th Chemical Company since July 2011 and has enrolled in officer training school at Camp Lincoln in Springfield, Illinois. Far too often our nation's educators do not receive the credit and recognition that they deserve. So I am proud to stand here today to congratulate Matthew Maddox for the work he does in the classroom and also to thank him for his service to our country. Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The Chair lays before the House the following personal request.
Leave of absence requested for Mr. Clyburn of South Carolina for today, Mr. Hinojosa of Texas on May 14, 2013, Mr. Gerry G. Miller of California for today and the balance of the week, and Mr. Young of Florida for today.
Without objection, the requests are granted. Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 3, 2013, the gentleman from Nebraska, Mr. Fortenberry, is recognized for 60 minutes as the designee of the Majority Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I recently visited the Eastern Nebraska Veterans Home in Bellevue. It's a lovely place that is well designed to care for those who have served in the protection of our country. I had a nice visit talking with many of the veterans there, each with their own unique stories of service to our nation. A conversation, though, with one man in particular, Mr. Speaker, has stuck with me ever since. Now in his 90s, Don McBride sat quietly as I was speaking to the entire group, but as I was leaving, I went over to him to thank him for his commendable service to our nation. But as soon as I got those words out, Don stopped me. You see, Don has a very interesting story. As I understand it, he did not directly enlist in the United States military. It was a unique situation. Don was a pilot with Pan Am Airlines, and during World War II, he helped the war effort by flying planes into China. During World War II, China was our ally. In all, Don flew 524 missions. He had to put a few planes down a couple of times because they were shot so badly, but he didn't stop. He and his fellow pilots did whatever was needed for the war effort, whether it was engaging Japanese aircraft or delivering aid to remote places in that rough terrain. For his service, Don was awarded the Presidential Citation, 4 Bronze Stars, the Air Medal, the Distinguished Flying Cross, and the China Service Medal. He didn't want to tell me all this. He was quite reserved about it. But his nurse encouraged him to share his story. But again, as I went to thank him, Don stopped me, and he said this, Mr. Speaker. He said, "We don't need any thanks. Every man here did it because he wanted to, because it was necessary. I don't know of anybody who has ever been sorry for serving." Mr. Speaker, it is this spirit of selflessness that lives on in so many of our veterans and the military men and women who are serving our nation today. They gave and continue to give for one simple reason. It is necessary, and it is their duty. On Memorial Day, this coming Monday, we will gather for an occasion that is both solemn and joyful. We honor those who gave everything in service to their countrymen. The formal remembrance of fallen heroes mixes feelings of both sorrow and pride. That a person would lay down his life for his friends, for another, is the noblest of human ideals. That we would unite in gratitude to reflect on the sacrifices of those who have gone before us is one of the greatest human expressions. And for those who are veterans, Mr. Speaker, who have stood next to persons who have given their all, perhaps holding them as they died, watching helplessly as war consumed another innocent life, their living presence, Mr. Speaker, the living presence of our veterans today, is an honor to those who did not come home. Communal remembrance is a long-standing human tradition. When we focus our remembrance on the war veterans who have sacrificed for us, the act is particularly meaningful and appropriate. Ever since there has been fighting and dying in war, there has been a calling in the human heart to memorialize the fallen heroes of battle, especially in this nation born in war, where the legacies of those who died defending our country are written on our hearts and are seen clearly in the blessings of liberty that we still hold today, in spite of our political divisions, in spite of the rancor and divisiveness that sometimes exist in this body and in our nation. We are still called to yield to proper reflection about that which is noble and that which is good. But, Mr. Speaker, yet for nearly 100 years, our fledgling country did not have a day set aside to remember and celebrate the sacrifices of fallen soldiers. In America, the practice of Memorial Day began in the years immediately following the Civil War. In 1868, the head of an organization of Union veterans established what was called Decoration Day at the time, for the nation to decorate the graves of the Civil War dead with flowers. The day picked was May 30th, a day in late spring, to ensure that the flowers would be in full bloom across our nation. Throughout the countryside, people began to visit cemeteries to decorate the graves of fallen soldiers, both Union and Confederate. On one noted occasion, women living near Columbus, Mississippi, deep within the defeated Confederacy, were so disturbed by the sight of the neglected graves of Union soldiers that they took care to see that these graves were properly decorated as well. Decoration Day grew in popularity and in practice, and by the early 1900s, ceremonies were held on May 30th throughout the nation. After World War I, the day was expanded to honor those who have died in all American wars. Decoration Day soon became known as Memorial Day. But it was only until 1971 that Memorial Day was declared a national holiday by an act of Congress to be celebrated annually on the last Monday in May. Mr. Speaker, this coming Monday we will continue this solemn tradition and reflect upon its profound meaning. We honor those fallen heroes of yesterday for their sacrifices on our behalf. Their bravery has afforded us the liberty and security we enjoy today. But the price of the blessings of peace has not come without great cost. Since the Revolutionary War, more than 42 million Americans have risked their lives for our country. Of those, more than 656,000 service members have died in battle. Their loss runs deep in the lives of those who they've left behind. Wives lost husbands, husbands lost wives, parents lost children, and children lost parents. The soldier's ultimate sacrifice is not merely his own, Mr. Speaker. In 1944, along the northern coastline of France, in a place called Normandy, the future of civilization hung in the balance. At 6:30 a.m. on June 6th, the first wave of American troops landed at a place called Omaha Beach. As their Higgins boat troop carriers opened, 18 and 19-year-old young men from cities and farms from New York to Nebraska were asked to do the impossible, dash across hundreds of yards of open beach with no cover in the face of a hail of just German machine gun fire and mortars, and take the high ground. Somehow, some way they did this. They withstood the violence and made their way to the steep hillside. Mr. Speaker, last winter I stood where those soldiers landed at water's edge and looked across that beach. It is hard to get the mind around the chaos of that day, to feel what they felt as the horror unfolded before them. I made my way to that steep hillside, now so peaceful and lovely, and stood in a German machine gun bunker. A young German soldier named Severlo manned the machine gun that day. And in a book that he wrote shortly before he died a few years ago, Severlo said that he wept as he fired his gun at the slaughter that unfolded before him. I walked around the nearby American cemetery with its orderly rows of white crosses testifying to the dear price our soldiers paid. I stopped at the grave of a young man named Billy D. Harris from Oklahoma. Billy D. Harris had married young and died young. His wife didn't know that her husband had been killed and buried there until about 10 years ago. Such is the chaos of war. She never remarried. She had all her hopes that her husband would one day return to her. I proceeded on to the little town of Saint-Mary-Église, where our airborne troops landed the night before the D-Day invasion. Some fell into the town square occupied by Germans. One soldier's parachute got caught on the church roof, and he hung there as the battle raged below. A replica of the parachute and soldier still hangs from the church today. In August of 1944, a young medical doctor left his wife and 2 children and entered the Army. He was first headquartered at a hospital in England, where the last official records show that he was located. As Patton's army moved against the Germans, Captain Luther Sexton Fortenberry went into action into France, probably to begin field operations there. In November of 1944, he was killed by ordnance explosion. He was my grandfather, and he was initially buried there at the cemetery at Saint-Mary-Église. Now he is reinterred here near Washington in Arlington National Cemetery. As a part of our civic life, Mr. Speaker, we honor the memory of all those who have served us. We all know of the great battles and heroic sacrifices at places like Bunker Hill, Omaha Beach, Khe Sanh, and Fallujah. What we do not know are the untold stories, witnessed by no one, of Americans who fought it out to the death to preserve our country. We also do not know the untold stories of the many who left their families and quietly performed their duty with no questions or demands made. The veterans who maintained tanks and aircraft, cooked, computed, cleaned, and drove. Today we not only honor our loved ones and ancestors lost long ago, as well as those who have left us recently. The sting of loss is not so distant for some whose loved ones have given their lives of late in Iraq and Afghanistan. Of the American soldiers who have been killed there, 72 were Nebraskans. Like so many of our colleagues, Mr. Speaker, I have attended many funerals and memorial services for those who have been killed from my district. I have seen many of the families bravely bear the weight of this devastation. I have seen communities come together to honor their local heroes and to help bring healing to these hurting families. I could not be more proud of these patriots and their family members, their remarkable bravery, their remarkable honor, their character, their selflessness. Young men and women of the highest caliber who, like so many before them, gave themselves for their country, fighting courageously for America and our ideals of liberty, equality, and justice for which they died. Mr. Speaker, I was recently contacted by the family of John Duong Dara. John and his family are new Americans. His parents came here from Laos. He was killed several years ago when his helicopter was shot down in Afghanistan. You may remember the incident. We lost 30 service members that day. On Memorial Day, John's family is gathering in South Sioux City, Nebraska, to erect a statue in his honor. I'm grateful, no, perhaps privileged, to be asked to join them on that day. Like his fellow soldiers, John Duong Dara was an American. He was loyal. He was brave. And now he is free. His sacrifice and the sacrifice of all American veterans brings to mind the seriousness of our time. And a Memorial Day is an especially important time for the reflection from lawmakers. We carry a tremendous responsibility to recognize the real life consequences behind our policy deliberation, analyses, and votes. On that first Decoration Day in 1868, Major General John Logan offered his post these words as he ordered them to decorate the graves of the war dead. He said this, Mr. Speaker: "We should guard their graves with sacred vigilance. Let pleasant paths invite the coming and going of reverent visitors and fond mourners. Let no neglect, no ravages of time testify to the present or to the coming generations that we have forgotten as a people the cost of a free and undivided republic. Mr. Speaker, during a visit to a nearby hospital to see our wounded here in Washington, there was a soldier there whose wounds were pretty devastating. And as I was leaving, I noticed there was a sign hanging on the outside of his door. It said, "America, land of the free, because of the brave." Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Under Speaker's announced policy of January 3rd, 2013, the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Cohen, is recognized for 60 minutes as the designee of the Minority Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today on behalf of the Congressional Progressive Caucus. Congressional Progressive Caucus has been fighting for economic fairness for the middle class and for those striving to be in the middle class for this entire country. And today we would like to talk specifically about the growing student debt, the skyrocketing student debt that we have in this country. Just this past weekend, 6,200 students graduated from the flagship university in my state, my alma mater, UW-Madison. These young people leave Madison with new friends, new skills, new knowledge, and most importantly, access to increased economic opportunity through their college diploma. Students with a bachelor's degree have half the unemployment rate of those with a high school degree, and in 2012, students with a bachelor's degree earned almost 80% more than someone with a high school diploma in a similar position. Unfortunately, these students are also leaving college with something else: unprecedented levels of student loan debt. The drastically increasing student loan debt held by Americans across the country can be considered nothing less than a crisis. Not a looming crisis, but an urgent, already here crisis. Total student debt in this country now tops $1 trillion. That exceeds all the credit card debt in this country. And that's up from just $200 billion in 2000, just 12 and a half years ago. And every second in America, total student debt increases by $2,854. According to the New York Federal Reserve, total student debt has tripled over the last 8 years, representing a 70% increase in both the number of people with debt and the average debt held per person. About two-thirds of the class of 2011 graduated with student debt, and their average debt was more than $26,000. And in my home state of Wisconsin, the weight of student loan debt is severely affecting college graduates' ability to support themselves and their families. There's an organization in Wisconsin I want to give a little thanks to and credit to, One Wisconsin Now, a progressive think tank run by Scott Ross. This organization has made it one of their leading efforts to talk about rising student debt and the trillion-dollar debt that we have and what it's doing to our economy. And thanks to them, I have some stories and figures to share, specific to Wisconsin and nationwide. According to one study from One Wisconsin, the average monthly payment made by Wisconsinites with a bachelor's or advanced degree is nearly $400 a month, $388 to be exact. Let's put it in this perspective. Before someone can pay their rent or their mortgage, their utilities, their groceries, child care, they already owe $400 in student loans. And if they're lucky, they'll have some funds left over to save for retirement. Because of these exorbitant rates, it will take the average citizen in my state almost 19 years to pay off their student loan debt from a four-year university. There are some long-term economic effects to this. The effects of the skyrocketing costs are twofold. Number one, at a time when a college degree is more important than ever to obtain reliable employment, we are in grave danger of pricing too many of our young students out of a college education. These drastic increases in tuition have occurred at the same time when we have seen the worst economic downturn since the Great Depression. We know that to compete for the jobs of the 21st century and to thrive in a global economy, we need a growing, skilled, and educated workforce, particularly in the areas of science, technology, engineering, and math. It is estimated that the U.S. will need 22 million more college-educated workers by the year 2018. Currently, driven partly by rising college costs, we are expected to fall short by 3 million workers. Our colleges and universities, such as UW-Madison and Beloit College and others in my district, have the talented faculty to produce our 21st century workforce, but they need the students to teach and train. And an unaffordable college education is an unaffordable future for our country. In the short term, we also see these effects in our economy. As students become more bogged down, more and more with high student loan debt, they are understandably reducing their expenditures in our current economy. According to one study by One Wisconsin, due to the high burdens put on students from their loans, new car purchases in our state are reduced by more than $200 million annually, and that's just in the state of Wisconsin. Meanwhile, households with student loan debt are overwhelmingly more likely to rent a home than to own a home, affecting home sales throughout America. Owning a home, buying a car, these aren't just typical byproducts of the American dream. These are important components of our country's overall economic health. If our economy is to recover not just in Wisconsin but across the country, we need to see strength in these two markets. So we find ourselves at a crossroads. Instead of providing an enriched educational background and advanced economic opportunity for our young people, a college education is increasingly trapping students in endless debt, preventing them from advancing economically and contributing to our economy. If we continue to believe that an accessible, affordable, and quality college education should be a national priority, then it is critical to our future economic prosperity. Then we need to come up with a long-term plan to manage the skyrocketing costs of education. Now, Democrats have already done a number of efforts in this area. We've tried to increase the maximum Pell Grant from $4,050 in 2016 to in 2014 to $5,645 in 2016. We have increased income-based repayment programs to ensure that graduates can manage loan repayments during stressed economic times. We have tried to create the American Opportunity Tax Credit, providing a maximum of $2,500 tuition tax credit to eligible families and students. We've provided loan forgiveness for graduates in public interest careers after 10 years of payments and for everybody else after 25 years of payments. And we have required schools to give an online calculator so that students and families could estimate their costs based on their family's financial conditions. But we need to and we must do more over the long run. We can restore consumer protections for our students. We can increase our funding for higher education, and we can reauthorize the Higher Education Act and protect programs like Pell Grants that support low-income students attending college. But as we all know, we have a pressing issue facing our body right now that will affect students who live in every single one of our districts. Unless we take action, on July 1st, interest rates on subsidized Stafford loans will double from 3.4% to 6.8%. If we do nothing, at a time when our country is still facing a steep economic recovery, 7 million low and middle income students nationwide will see their student loan rates increase. That's 7 million people in this country will have their rates increase on student loans. That will wind up costing student borrowers $1,000 more a year. If we do nothing, that will add $4.3 billion to students' debt burden in just 1 year alone. Quite simply, we cannot afford to do nothing. Allowing these interest rates to double would represent a derelict of our duties. And right now, banks can receive loans from the Federal Reserve at historically low levels, less than 1%. If banks can receive such loans, shouldn't we protect lower loans for our students who are struggling in today's economy more than anyone else? Last year, before I arrived in Washington, Congress extended the 3.4% rate for 1 full year. There are a number of bills right now, including those introduced by my Democratic colleagues, that would extend the 3.4% rate by at least 1 year, if not more. But we must take action now before we risk drowning our future workforce in even more student loan debt. Now, this body, this House, tomorrow will be taking up a measure, H.R. 1911, the Make College More Expensive Act. Unfortunately, the legislation this body will consider, instead of providing needed relief for our students, will instead only make college more expensive for millions of young people and their families across the country. As I mentioned, if we don't act by July 1, interest rates on subsidized student loans will double from 3.4% to 6.8%. The Republican legislation that we have before us tomorrow would be even worse for students than if we did nothing at all. By tying federal student loan rates to the 10-year Treasury note, the interest rate for a student entering college next year will be reset every year he or she is in college. Why is that a problem? Well, because by the time next year's freshmen graduate and start repaying their loans in the year 2017, the interest rate that freshmen had on his or her first loan their first year of college is projected to more than double beyond today's current rate for subsidized Stafford loans. In practical terms, what that means over the long run is a student who's about to enroll in their first year of college will pay higher interest rates under the Republican plan than if Congress lets the current rates double. Again, this bill is even more damaging than if we do nothing, which we shouldn't do as a body at all. According to the Nonpartisan Congressional Research Service, students who borrow the maximum amount of Stafford loans over 5 years will pay $1,300 more in interest rates under the Republican plan before this body tomorrow than if we allowed those rates to double, and nearly $6,000 more than if we kept the rates at 3.4%. The overall cost to students and families would be $4 billion in additional interest payments over the next decade compared to our current law. And let me repeat that. If we pass H.R. 1911, it will cost our students and families $4 billion more over the next 10 years than if we keep the law the way it is. These facts don't lie. The bill does not make college more affordable. It does just the opposite. It worsens the student debt crisis that we should be working to solve. And this is just another case of mistaken priorities and misguided plans. While the Democrats are working hard to even the playing field, Republicans would make it even harder for the average American to be able to afford college. H.R. 1911 imposes a long-term financial burden on young people looking to pursue higher educations. It will put $4 billion additional in student debt over the next decade that would have been used otherwise to help pay down our deficit. This is not a sustainable, balanced way to deal with our deficit, and it's certainly no way to ensure a thriving future for the next generation of America. We've seen time and time again how student debt stifles our economy. We cannot afford to make college more expensive for the very Americans trying to get that education. I am very pleased to be joined by another freshman member of this body, a representative from the state of New York, who is author of one of these bills that will make sure that we keep that interest rate at 3.4% and not allow it to double on July 1. I would like, Mr. Speaker, to yield my time to Mr. Jeffries of New York.
Well, let me first thank the distinguished gentleman from the Badger State, my good friend, Representative Mark Pocan, who has been such a tremendous leader on this issue and a tremendous leader on issues of significance to progressive America, to America, in fact, during his short time in the Congress. We've seen week after week, month after month, Representative Pocan has come to the floor of the House of Representatives, the People's House, and boldly